let me ask you this. What would you do if you were trapped on a rocky island miles off the coast of Maine, surrounded by nothing but crashing waves and black ocean, and the only thing standing between you and utter darkness started acting like it was alive? This isn't some horror movie script. This is a true horror story. One of the creepiest, unexplained lighthouse mysteries I've ever heard. And it happened to my cousin Ethan Walker, a seasoned Coast Guard serviceman who doesn't scare easily and has spent over a decade working the harsh Atlantic waters. Matinus Rock is just a brutal hunk of rock barely 300 feet across with a single towering lighthouse and a metal staircase that spirals 50 feet up to the beacon room. No power grid, no plumbing, barely a cell signal, and that damn beacon's sweeping light is the only heartbeat keeping the blackness at bay. In 2017, Ethan was sent there with another Coast Guard tech named Russell because of some electrical issues from the year before. They expected boring routine checks and long quiet nights, but what they found instead nearly broke both of them. There's something about isolated places that breeds secrets, and on Matinus Rock the darkness felt thicker than anywhere else. Ethan says he'd never believed in ghosts or cursed places until those nights when the lighthouse lights suddenly stopped spinning and something began leaving wet, seaweed-soaked cloths deep inside the gears. And that was only the beginning, because by the time it was over, there would be whispers, footsteps on the metal stairs, and a chilling radio transmission that might be the scariest Coast Guard horror story ever recorded. This is the true account of what really happened out there. A creepy real story about a place so haunted that even the ocean seems afraid to touch it. My cousin Ethan Walker has always been the kind of guy who looks fear in the face and tells it to get lost. He's been in the Coast Guard for over a decade, working on boats in brutal Atlantic storms, handling rescue ops, and living a life built around rules, routine, and hard reality. He's not the type to make up ghost stories or believe in supernatural legends, which is exactly why I can't shake what he told me about Matinus Rock, a place that might just be the scariest true horror story the Coast Guard has ever kept quiet. The official records just call it a maintenance post off the Maine coast, nothing more than a brutal chunk of rock jutting up from the ocean about 300 feet across with a 50-foot lighthouse and a metal spiral staircase that clangs with every footstep. But Ethan swears the darkness there is thicker than anywhere else, and that the beacon's sweeping light sometimes catches things it's not supposed to see. He was assigned there in 2017 along with another tech named Russell, because the lighthouse had suffered strange electrical failures the year before, a fact no one seemed eager to explain. Their first few days were nothing but routine checks, salty wind-scraping corrosion off metal walls, and that eerie, endless boom of the waves. But everything changed on the fourth night, when Ethan woke up feeling the air pressing down like a storm was about to rip the sky apart. Only the skies were perfectly clear. And then he noticed the lighthouse beacon wasn't moving. The big industrial gears were still whirring, but the beam itself was jammed by a piece of soaking, wet, moss-covered cloth that smelled like rotting seaweed wedged so deep into the mechanism it seemed impossible for it to have gotten there on its own. Ethan and Russell pulled it out, threw it off the balcony into the wind, and tried to tell themselves it was just some freak accident. But that was only the first sign that Matinus Rock hides an unexplained lighthouse mystery far darker than any storm the Atlantic could throw at them. Because what happened the next night made Ethan realize that this wasn't just about a stuck piece of cloth, and the lighthouse's sweeping beam would soon reveal far more than just the ocean's waves. And that's exactly where things start getting terrifying. Ethan tried to convince himself that finding that soaked piece of fabric jammed into the lighthouse gears was just some random fluke, maybe a scrap of tarp blown in by a freak gust of wind. But the very next night, just past 2 a.m., he woke up again with that same heavy pressure in the air, like the ocean itself was holding its breath, and he glanced toward the window to see total darkness where the sweeping glow of the beacon should have been. He felt his stomach drop, because if there's one thing the Coast Guard drills into you, it's that a lighthouse light never goes out without a damn good reason. He grabbed Russell, and they hustled back up those narrow 50-foot stairs, their boots clanging on the steel like gunshots in the silence, and this time what they found was even stranger than before. Instead of a big black sheet, the jammed object was a smaller piece of fabric, a deep red scarf frayed at the edges, drenched as if it had just been pulled out of the sea, tiny crustaceans clinging to its threads. And in that moment, Ethan said all the logic in the world couldn't explain how the hell something like that made its way into locked machinery inside a sealed tower. That was the first time a real chill crawled up his spine, a feeling that someone or something was deliberately trying to shut the beacon down. But the thing that unsettled him more than the wet scarf was Russell. Because when Ethan glanced over, he found Russell staring into the shadows like he was listening to someone speak his lips, moving soundlessly, eyes wide and glassy, as if hypnotized by some silent voice in the walls. And when Ethan asked him what he was saying, Russell blinked slow and seemed to snap out of it, insisting he hadn't said a word. After that, Russell began to drift further away each day, barely sleeping, standing for hours at the window, whispering about figures moving on the rocks below, and the fear that the beacon was being watched by something that wanted it dark. That's the moment Ethan realized they weren't just dealing with a maintenance issue, but were caught inside one of the most terrifying, unexplained lighthouse mysteries ever recorded, a true horror story that was only getting darker because the noises in the stairwell were about to become impossible to ignore. By the 9th night on Matinus Rock, Ethan said he'd given up trying to convince himself that any of this was just mechanical trouble, because that's when the sound started. Not the usual groans and creaks you'd expect from a metal tower being battered by Atlantic winds, but precise, deliberate footsteps echoing down the spiral stairs above their heads. Slow, heavy, one step at a time, like someone in wet boots trying not to slip. Ethan froze in his cot, every hair on his neck standing up because Russell was already standing at the base of the staircase, staring up into the darkness, his eyes wide and terrified. When Ethan whispered if Russell had gone up there, Russell just shook his head, voice trembling as he said, "I thought it was you." The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they started leaving the kind of silence that seems to scream in your ears, the kind that makes your pulse pound so hard it almost drowns out your own breathing. From that moment on, they barricaded the stairwell every night, shoving crates and furniture in place like their lives depended on it. But it didn't matter, because on the 11th night, all hell broke loose. Ethan woke to wind howling through the lighthouse louder than he'd ever heard it, and he knew instantly something was wrong. The beacon's light wasn't sweeping the rocks outside. When he and Russell burst into the beacon room, the heavy steel door was thrown wide open, swinging on its hinges, salt spray whipping in off the ocean. And there in the center of the floor, the industrial beacon bulb, a piece of equipment you can't unscrew by hand, was sitting upright, completely removed from its socket, glistening under the flickering emergency lights. Russell stared at it like he was watching his worst nightmare take shape, and Ethan's blood ran cold when he felt something icy brush across his lower back, like a wet hand sliding against his skin. He spun around, ready to fight whoever was there, but there was nothing behind him except Russell pointing at the brick wall, whispering that he saw a hand pushing through the stones. That was the moment Ethan realized they weren't alone on Matinus Rock, and that whatever was trying to kill the lighthouse light wasn't done with them yet, and the next morning would bring the most chilling twist of all. The next morning, Ethan was done pretending that anything about Matinus Rock made sense. Russell was sitting in the corner of the room, knees pulled up to his chest, rocking back and forth, and mumbling to someone who wasn't there, his eyes red and distant, like he hadn't slept in days. Ethan knew that whatever was inside that lighthouse wasn't going to stop until they were either gone or it was. So he used the emergency sat phone and called in for an early pickup, telling command there was a serious mechanical failure, though he could barely keep his voice steady enough to explain why. Hours later, when the Coast Guard boat finally showed up, cutting through whitecaps and spray, Ethan felt like he could breathe for the first time in days. But that relief turned to ice when one of the crewmen leaned over the railing and shouted, "Hey, which one of you guys called in the Mayday at 2:12 this morning?" Ethan froze. He told them flat out he hadn't touched the phone until daylight. The deckhand insisted they'd received a garbled transmission through heavy static. A voice sounding half-drowned kept repeating something about someone being there with them. Then it cut out completely. And that's the part Ethan says he still can't explain, the part that makes this one of the scariest true horror stories ever tied to any lighthouse on the East Coast. Because if he didn't make the call, who did? Russell never said another word the entire ride back to the mainland. A few months later, he resigned from the Coast Guard without telling anyone the real reason why. And Ethan, even though he still does maintenance runs, sometimes swears he will never set foot on Matinus Rock again. Some places, he says, are meant to be left alone, and out there, surrounded by cold black waves and the echo of that sweeping beacon light, it feels like the ocean itself wants to keep its secrets. But there's one more thing Ethan told me, And it's the reason I'm sharing this story online. Because sometimes, even when you leave a place behind, the darkness finds a way to follow you home. So maybe you're thinking right now that Matinus Rock is just another creepy lighthouse mystery, or that Ethan and Russell were simply victims of isolation playing tricks on their minds. But I keep going back to that single radio call at 2:12 a.m., a voice no one admits to making carrying words that sound too human and too terrified to be a glitch. And it makes me wonder how many other places out there hold secrets that want to stay hidden beneath the surface, secrets that reach through walls and machinery to remind us that not every dark corner of the ocean is empty. That's the thing about true horror stories. Sometimes they end with you walking away alive, but a part of you stays trapped out there forever. And if you've ever felt chills running down your spine while staring at a lighthouse beam slicing through the night, you know exactly what I mean. Drop a comment below if you'd ever spend a night alone on Matinus Rock, or if there's no way in hell you'd even set foot on that island. Smash the like button, save this video to your horror playlist, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story coming up, because trust me, the nightmare doesn't end here. Next, we're diving into another true horror story. One that happened on the shores of Long Island, New York, where a casual late-night adventure near the Montauk Lighthouse turned into a terrifying close call, with something far more dangerous than just trespassing after dark.